The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Alex made his way down the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The 16-year-old pulled his worn backpack closer, walking the familiar route to school, while lost in thoughts about the math test he hadn't studied enough for. His mom had been working late shifts again at the hospital, and he'd spent most of his evening helping his younger sister with her homework instead of reviewing his own notes. The autumn air was crisp, making him wish he'd grabbed a warmer jacket. Fallen leaves crunched under his feet as he walked past the row of small houses, each one showing signs of early morning life. Lights flickering on, cars warming up in driveways, and the smell of breakfast wafting through open windows. It was just another ordinary Thursday, or at least that's what he thought. As he turned onto Oak Street, a sound caught his attention. At first, he wasn't sure what he'd heard. Maybe it was just the wind or a stray cat. But there it was again. A faint cry that seemed to come from somewhere behind old Mrs. Chen's house. Most kids his age would have kept walking, already running late for first period. But something about that sound tugged at him, reminding him of when his grandmother had fallen in the garden last summer and couldn't get up for almost an hour. Alex checked his watch. He still had 20 minutes before the first bell. The sound grew more distinct as he approached the narrow alley between the houses. His heart started beating faster when he realized it was definitely someone calling for help. The voice was weak, elderly, and clearly distressed. Moving closer to investigate, he had to squeeze past some overgrown bushes and a rusty bike rack. The alley was dim despite the morning sun, shadowed by the tall fences on either side. That's when he saw her. An elderly woman trapped beneath what looked like a metal ramp that had broken away from her back door. She was conscious, but clearly frightened, her white hair disheveled and her eyes wide with relief at seeing another person. "Oh, thank goodness," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I've been here since I tried to fix this ramp last night. I thought nobody would find me." She tried to smile despite her situation, showing remarkable courage for someone who had spent the night trapped in such a terrifying position. Without hesitation, Alex dropped his backpack and assessed the situation. The ramp wasn't huge, but it was made of solid metal, the kind meant to help wheelchairs access the back door. It must have come loose from its moorings when she was trying to repair it. The woman had managed to partially protect herself by turning sideways, but she was still firmly pinned down. "Don't worry," Alex assured her, trying to keep his voice calm despite his racing thoughts. "I'm going to help you, but I need to make sure I don't make things worse. Can you tell me if anything hurts?" He remembered the first aid basics his mom had taught him. Always check for injuries before moving someone. The woman explained she was mostly just cold and scared, but didn't think anything was broken. Alex knew he needed to act fast but smart. He looked around and spotted a long piece of wood that could work as a lever. His hands were trembling slightly from adrenaline, but his mind was clear. He had to help her, even though he could now hear the distant school bell ringing. Some things were more important than being on time for class. What he didn't notice, in his focused determination to help, was the blinking red light of a security camera above the back door, or the neighbor peering through their kitchen window, phone already in hand. In just a few minutes, his ordinary morning would turn into something no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. Alex knew he had to act quickly but carefully. The metal ramp was heavier than he expected, and the elderly woman's face showed a mix of hope and worry as he positioned himself to lift it. His heart was pounding, not just from the effort, but from the responsibility of helping someone in such a vulnerable position. "I'm going to try to lift this slowly," he explained, his voice steady despite his nerves. "When I do, try to move away if you can, but don't rush. We'll take it one step at a time." The woman nodded, her eyes trustful despite meeting him just moments ago. It reminded him of the way his grandmother looked at him when she needed help with her groceries. The autumn morning air was getting colder, and Alex could see the woman shivering slightly. He took off his school jacket and carefully placed it over her shoulders, earning a grateful smile that made him even more determined to help. The metal ramp was ice cold to touch, and he realized she must have been freezing all night. Bracing himself, Alex got a good grip on the edge of the ramp. Years of helping out at his uncle's garage had made him stronger than most kids his age, but this would still be a challenge. He took a deep breath and began to lift. The muscles in his arms strained as he slowly raised the heavy metal structure. It felt like trying to lift his mom's car, but he knew someone's safety depended on him. The woman winced as the pressure eased off her body, but her face showed relief. "You're doing great, dear," she encouraged him, her voice stronger now. "Just a little more." Alex's arms were shaking from the effort, but her words gave him an extra burst of strength. With one final push, he managed to lift the ramp high enough for her to carefully slide away. As soon as she was clear, Alex carefully lowered the ramp back down, trying not to make too much noise. He immediately knelt beside the woman, remembering everything his mom had taught him about first aid. "Are you hurt anywhere? Can you move your legs and arms okay?" he asked, scanning for any visible injuries. The woman slowly sat up, checking herself. "I think I'm just cold and stiff," she replied, pulling his jacket closer around her shoulders. "My name's Mrs. Lee. I've lived here for 40 years, and I've never had such a frightening night." Her hands were trembling, but her voice was becoming steadier. "Would you help me inside? I need to sit down properly and get warm." Alex nodded, offering his arm for support. As they made their way to her back door, Mrs. Lee explained how she'd been trying to fix the loose ramp herself, not wanting to bother her children who lived in another state. "I'm not as young as I used to be," she admitted with a small laugh, "but I still like to do things on my own." Just as they reached the door, a loud siren pierced the morning quiet. Red and blue lights flooded the alley, and Alex's stomach dropped as he realized what this must look like to anyone watching. He was a stranger in someone's backyard, with an elderly woman who looked distressed. "Police, don't move," a stern voice commanded from the other side of the fence. Alex froze, his hand still supporting Mrs. Lee's elbow. His mind raced. How could he explain this? Would anyone believe he was just trying to help? The sound of heavy boots approaching made his heart skip a beat. Mrs. Lee gripped his arm tighter, but not from fear of him. "Don't worry," she whispered quickly. "I'll tell them everything. You did nothing wrong." But as two officers rounded the corner with their hands on their holsters, Alex realized that sometimes doing the right thing could look very, very wrong. The next few moments felt like they were moving in slow motion. Two police officers approached cautiously, their expressions stern and suspicious. Alex's mind was racing, but he stayed perfectly still, one hand still supporting Mrs. Lee's elbow. He'd never been in trouble with the law before. The worst thing he'd ever done was forget to return a library book on time. "Step away from the woman," the first officer commanded, his voice firm but professional. Alex began to move slowly, but Mrs. Lee's grip on his arm tightened. "No, you don't understand," she started to explain, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and urgency. "This young man saved me." But things were already in motion. A neighbor was shouting from their window about seeing someone suspicious jumping the fence. The security alarm, which had been silently triggered when they approached the back door, was now blaring its delayed response. Everything was happening at once, creating a chaos of noise and confusion. "Ma'am, are you all right? Has he hurt you?" the second officer asked, moving closer while keeping a watchful eye on Alex. The morning sun cast long shadows in the alley, making everything feel more dramatic than it should have been. Alex could feel his heart pounding so hard, he thought everyone must be able to hear it. "He didn't hurt me. He helped me." Mrs. Lee's voice was getting stronger now, her small frame straightening up despite her exhaustion. "I was trapped under that ramp all night." She pointed to the fallen metal structure, "and this boy found me and lifted it off. He gave me his jacket when I was cold. He's a hero, not a criminal." Despite Mrs. Lee's protests, the officers followed their protocol. They gently separated them, one staying with Mrs. Lee while the other moved Alex to the side. "Put your hands where I can see them," the officer instructed. Alex complied, his school backpack still lying forgotten by the fallen ramp. "Officer, please check my security cameras," Mrs. Lee insisted, her voice cracking with emotion. "They'll show you everything. This is all a terrible misunderstanding." She tried to move toward Alex, but the officer beside her kept her back, concerned about her unsteady steps. More neighbors were gathering now, drawn by the commotion. Some were filming with their phones, while others whispered among themselves. Alex could see his classmate's parent among the onlookers, and his heart sank thinking about how fast this news would spread at school. The first officer was speaking into his radio, requesting backup and an ambulance to check on Mrs. Lee. All Alex could think about was his mom, how worried she would be, how this might affect her job at the hospital if people found out her son had been arrested. But he knew he'd done the right thing. If he had to make the choice again, he'd still stop to help. Mrs. Lee was still trying to explain, her voice getting more frustrated with each passing moment. "Look at his jacket. I'm wearing it. Why would someone trying to hurt me give me their jacket? Please, just look at the security footage before you do anything else." The morning had turned surreal. Students walking to school slowed down to stare, and cars drove by at a crawl to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Alex could hear snippets of conversation from the growing crowd, some defending him, others assuming the worst. It was amazing how quickly people could jump to conclusions without knowing the whole story. As a police car pulled up in front of a house, Alex caught Mrs. Lee's eye. She gave him a determined look that somehow made him feel a little better. Sometimes the truth takes a while to come out, but it always does in the end. Still, as the officer began to read him his rights, Alex couldn't help but wonder how trying to do a good deed had turned into the most confusing morning of his life. News of what happened spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By lunchtime, social media was buzzing with shaky phone videos of Alex being placed in the police car, while Mrs. Lee continued pleading with the officers. Different versions of the story were floating around, some painting Alex as a troublemaker, others questioning why the police had acted so quickly without hearing the full story. The small local coffee shop where Alex's mom worked part-time on weekends became an unexpected hub of discussion. Regular customers who'd known Alex since he was a little boy couldn't believe what they were hearing. "That kid." "No way," said the old man who always sat by the window. "He's the one who helped me change my tire in the rain last month. Didn't even want to take the money I offered him." At Alex's high school, his empty seat in first period sparked conversations. His physics teacher, who'd known him for 2 years, stood up for him during a staff meeting. "In all my years of teaching," she told her colleagues, "I've never met a student more willing to help others. Just last week, he stayed after class to tutor a struggling student, completely on his own time." Meanwhile, Mrs. Lee wasn't sitting quietly at home. Despite the paramedics' advice to rest, she was making phone calls. Her grandson, who worked at a local news station, listened to her story and immediately recognized its importance. "Grandma," he said, "people need to hear about this. It's not just about Alex. It's about how quick we are to assume the worst in people." The local news station picked up the story, and their social media post went viral. "Teen arrested after saving elderly woman." But there's more to this story. They included a screenshot from Mrs. Lee's security camera showing Alex lifting the heavy ramp, his face strained with effort as he worked to free her. Community members who had witnessed Alex's everyday acts of kindness began sharing their own stories online. The librarian wrote about how he'd helped elderly patrons carry their books to their cars. The grocery store owner mentioned how Alex would often assist older customers with their shopping bags. Each story painted a picture of a young man who consistently chose to help others without seeking recognition. Mrs. Lee's neighbors, feeling guilty about their quick judgments, started a social media campaign with the hashtag #BelieveInKindness. The neighbor who had initially called the police wrote a public apology. I saw someone climbing a fence and assumed the worst. I should have looked more carefully or asked what was happening. My mistake could have ruined someone's life. The local youth center, where Alex volunteered on weekends, organized a peaceful gathering to show support. Young kids made signs with messages like, "Heroes don't always wear capes," and "Thank you for stopping to help." Their simple, honest words carried more weight than any formal statement could. Even the town's mayor got involved, calling for a review of how similar situations should be handled in the future. "We need to balance safety with common sense," she said in a statement. "When someone takes the time to help others, we should be celebrating that, not punishing it." As the true story emerged, more security footage was released showing the entire rescue. People could see Alex's careful approach, his gentle help, and the moment he gave Mrs. Lee his jacket. The same phones that had recorded his arrest were now sharing these clips, showing how quickly judgment can turn to understanding when all the facts come to light. By the end of the day, the incident had sparked a larger conversation in the community about trust, judgment, and the importance of looking out for one another. What started as a misunderstanding was turning into something much more meaningful. A reminder that in a world quick to assume the worst, there are still people willing to stop and help, no matter the consequences. Mrs. Lee sat in her living room, surrounded by stacks of letters and printed emails from people all over the city. Her hands trembled slightly as she read each message of support for Alex. She couldn't rest knowing that a young man was in trouble for helping her, so she had turned her dining room into a makeshift command center for what she called Operation Truth. Her grandson had brought over his laptop and showed her how to start an online petition. At first, she'd been hesitant about using technology. She still preferred writing things by hand, but seeing the number of signatures climb hour by hour gave her hope. "We're at 10,000 signatures now, Grandma," he said, refreshing the screen. "People really care about this." The security camera footage told the whole story clearly. Mrs. Lee watched it again and again with different police officers and news reporters who came to interview her. Each time she saw Alex lifting that heavy ramp, her heart filled with gratitude and determination. "Look at how careful he was," she would point out. "He checked if I was hurt before moving me. What kind of criminal does that?" While the police department reviewed the case, Mrs. Lee received unexpected support from her doctor. "You could have died from exposure," he told her during a checkup. "If that young man hadn't found you when he did, we might be having a very different conversation." He wrote an official letter explaining the medical dangers she had faced and how Alexa's quick action had potentially saved her life. The local senior center, where Mrs. Lee played bingo every Thursday, became another hub of support. The elderly members shared stories about times when young people had helped them, and how fear often made them hesitant to accept assistance. "We need more young folks like Alex," said one old gentleman, tapping his cane for emphasis, "and we need to stop being so scared of everyone who tries to help." Mrs. Lee's daughter flew in from out of state, worried about her mother but also moved by the story. She helped organize a community meeting at the local library, where other elderly residents came forward to share their own experiences. One woman tearfully described how she'd fallen in her garden last summer, and nobody had stopped to help because they were afraid of getting involved. The local paper ran a front-page story titled "A Helper in Need of Help," featuring Mrs. Lee's impassioned plea for justice. She showed them the jacket Alex had given her, still hanging carefully on her coat rack. "He was more worried about me being cold than about getting to school on time," she told the reporter, her voice full of emotion. "That's not something you can fake." Support came from unexpected places too. The owner of the hardware store where the wheelchair ramp had been purchased offered to install a new, safer one for free. "And this time," he insisted, "you call us for repairs, Mrs. Lee. No more midnight fix-it attempts." As she worked tirelessly to clear Alex's name, Mrs. Lee learned more about him from neighbors and teachers. She discovered that he helped care for his younger sister while their mom worked long shifts at the hospital. That he mowed lawns for elderly neighbors in the summer, often refusing payment. That he was saving up for college but still shared his lunch with kids who forgot theirs. Each new detail strengthened her resolve. She may have been just one elderly woman, but she had lived in this community for 40 years, and people listened when she spoke up. "I won't rest until this is made right," she told anyone who would listen. "That boy lifted a heavy metal ramp to save me. The least I can do is lift this burden from his shoulders." As the sun set on another day of campaigning, Mrs. Lee looked at all the supportive messages and smiled. Sometimes it takes a mistake to bring out the best in a community, and she was determined to prove that kindness, even when misunderstood, should never be punished. The police station was buzzing with activity as the chief of police reviewed the case files spread across his desk. The security camera footage played on his computer screen for what felt like the 100th time. He rubbed his temples, realizing that what had seemed like a routine arrest had turned into something that was making his department look terrible. "Have you seen the comments online?" his assistant asked, placing another stack of letters on his desk. The public response had been overwhelming. Phone calls flooded in from across the city, and even national news outlets were starting to pick up the story. It wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It had become a symbol of something bigger. Down the hall, two officers who had been first on the scene sat reviewing their body camera footage. The younger officer shook his head. "We should have listened more carefully," he said, watching Mrs. Lee's desperate attempts to explain on the video. "Look at how she was trying to tell us the whole time." His partner nodded silently, both of them knowing they'd have to do better next time. The investigation team had worked through the night, piecing together every detail. They'd interviewed neighbors, reviewed all camera angles, and even brought in experts to analyze the fallen ramp. Everything confirmed exactly what Mrs. Lee had been saying from the start. Alex was nothing more than a good kid who'd stopped to help someone in need. Meanwhile, community pressure was mounting. The police department's social media pages were filled with comments from citizens demanding action. Local business owners who knew Alex and his family shared stories of his character. The owner of the diner where Alex's mom sometimes worked extra shifts had posted a particularly moving message. "I've watched this kid grow up, helping his mom, never complaining. If he's a criminal, then we need more criminals like him." The chief called an emergency meeting with his top officers. The conference room was tense as they reviewed the evidence one final time. "We have to make this right," he said, looking around the table. "And we have to make sure it never happens again." They weren't just talking about Alex anymore, but about changing how they approached similar situations in the future. As they drafted their official response, the chief insisted on transparency. "No sugarcoating," he told his public relations team. "We made a mistake, and we need to own it." It wasn't easy admitting errors, especially for a department that prided itself on protecting the community, but sometimes leadership meant acknowledging when you got things wrong. The statement they prepared was simple and direct. They explained how the initial response, while following protocol, had failed to take into account the full situation. They detailed the evidence that cleared Alex of any wrongdoing, and most importantly, they outlined changes they would make to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. But the chief wanted to do more than just issue a statement. He decided that the department needed to make a more personal gesture. After discussing it with his team, he planned to deliver the news to Alex and his family in person, not through a lawyer or over the phone. It was the least they could do after what the young man had been through. As the day drew to a close, the chief stood at his office window, watching the sun set over the city. On his desk lay the final paperwork, official documents clearing Alex of all charges, an apology letter, and something extra his team had suggested: a civilian commendation for bravery and community service. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to fix a mistake was not just to admit it, but to turn it into an opportunity to recognize the very thing you had initially misunderstood. The next morning would bring reporters and cameras, questions, and scrutiny, but for now, he focused on the simple truth that had emerged from all this. In trying to protect their community, they had almost punished one of its finest young citizens. It was a lesson none of them would soon forget. During all the commotion surrounding Alex's case, Mrs. Lee had been doing some quiet investigating of her own. She noticed how Alex's mom would hurry from her hospital shift straight to her second job at the local diner, her nurse's scrubs barely hidden under her waitress apron. She saw how Alex would walk his little sister home from school every day, carrying both their backpacks while she skipped alongside him. One afternoon, Mrs. Lee invited Alex's mom over for tea. The younger woman looked exhausted but still managed a warm smile. As they sat in Mrs. Lee's cozy living room, the true story of their family's struggles began to unfold. Alex's mom worked double shifts to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Their dad had passed away 3 years ago, leaving them with mountains of medical bills. Alex never complains, his mom said softly, stirring her tea. He helps with his sister, keeps his grades up, and still finds time to help neighbors. I just wish. Her voice trailed off, but Mrs. Lee understood. She was wishing she could give her son more, do more for him, make his life easier somehow. What touched Mrs. Lee most was learning that despite their own struggles, Alex and his family still helped others. His mom would sometimes slip extra food to elderly customers at the diner who she knew were living on fixed incomes. Alex would shovel snow from neighbors' driveways in winter without being asked. Even his little sister had started a reading club at school to help younger kids with their books. That evening, Mrs. Lee couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about how this family, with so little to spare, gave so much to others. She remembered the weight of that metal ramp, how Alex had lifted it without hesitation, not knowing or caring who she was. He'd helped simply because help was needed. The next morning, she made some phone calls. First to her grandson, who worked at the local news station, then to her friend who ran the community center. By afternoon, she was sitting with a small group of community leaders in her living room, sharing her idea over cookies and coffee. This isn't just about clearing his name anymore, she explained, her eyes bright with purpose. It's about recognizing that there are people in our community who give everything they have to help others, even when they themselves could use a helping hand. The group listened intently as Mrs. Lee outlined her plan. The bank manager nodded thoughtfully, making notes. The high school principal leaned forward in his chair, already thinking about how to involve the school. The owner of the local grocery store started making calls right there in Mrs. Lee's living room. What emerged from that meeting was more than just a plan to help one family. It was the beginning of something bigger. They would create a community support program, starting with Alex's family, but extending to others in similar situations. The bank would offer financial planning services. The community college would provide scholarship opportunities. Local businesses would create part-time job opportunities with flexible schedules for working parents. As the group worked out the details, Mrs. Lee sat back in her chair, watching them with satisfaction. Sometimes it takes a dramatic event to open people's eyes to the quiet struggles and silent heroes in their midst. She thought about how Alex had stopped that morning to help her, not knowing that his simple act of kindness would end up helping so many others. When Alex's mom came by later that evening to return a borrowed teacup, Mrs. Lee couldn't help but smile, knowing what was being planned. Sometimes the best changes in a community start with one person stopping to help another, she thought. And sometimes those who give the most deserve to receive a little help in return. The community center was packed on a bright Saturday morning. People had started arriving an hour early, carrying homemade dishes and setting up chairs. Alex had no idea what was waiting for him. He thought he was just coming to help Mrs. Lee with a community breakfast event, something he'd done many times before. When he walked through the doors with his mom and sister, the room erupted in applause. For a moment, he froze, not understanding what was happening. Then he saw the banner. Celebrating our community heroes. Mrs. Lee stood at the front of the room, beaming with pride, while familiar faces from around the neighborhood smiled back at him. The bank president stepped forward first. "In recognition of your selfless service to our community," she announced, "we've established a full college scholarship in your name." Alex's mom gasped, gripping his arm tightly. The scholarship would cover not just his education, but would be given annually to students who demonstrated extraordinary community service. But that was just the beginning. The owner of the local grocery store announced they were creating a new community support program, inspired by Alex's family. "We've seen how you help elderly customers with their groceries," he said. "Now we want to help others do the same." The program would provide part-time jobs to students who helped elderly and disabled neighbors with shopping and errands. The hospital where Alex's mom worked had a surprise too. Her supervisor announced they were adjusting her schedule and raising her salary, allowing her to spend more time with her children. "We've been watching how your family supports our community," he said. "Now it's our turn to support you." Tears flowed freely as more announcements followed. The high school principal spoke about a new mentoring program, named after Alex, where students would help elderly residents learn computer skills. The local hardware store presented Mrs. Lee with a properly installed wheelchair ramp, along with a maintenance service for other elderly residents. Alex's little sister couldn't contain her excitement when the library announced they were expanding her reading club into a full after-school program. She hugged her brother tightly, whispering, "You made all this happen by being you." The police chief's speech brought a hushed silence to the room. He spoke about lessons learned and changes made. The department was implementing new training programs focused on community engagement and understanding. "Your story," he told Alex, "has changed how we approach our work. Sometimes the biggest heroes are the ones quietly helping others every day." Mrs. Lee saved her surprise for last. She unveiled a community support network connecting elderly residents with young volunteers. "When I was trapped under that ramp," she said, her voice strong with emotion, "I thought no one would help. But Alex proved that there are still people who care enough to stop, to help, to make a difference." The celebration continued throughout the day, but it wasn't just about the presents or programs. Something more important was happening. People who'd lived as neighbors for years were really talking to each other, sharing stories, discovering connections they never knew existed. An elderly man told stories about how Alex had fixed his fence last summer. A young mother spoke about how Alex's sister had helped her son learn to read. The diner owner shared how Alex's mom always made sure the elderly customers got extra portions when they were running low on money at the end of the month. As Alex looked around the room, he saw more than just familiar faces. He saw a community that had learned to look past quick judgments and see the good in people. His simple act of stopping to help had sparked something bigger than himself, reminding everyone that sometimes the most important things we do are the small acts of kindness we show each other every day. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning when Alex stopped to help Mrs. Lee. The neighborhood had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The once quiet streets were now filled with young people helping elderly residents, carrying groceries, fixing gardens, and most importantly, stopping to chat and listen to their stories. Every Tuesday afternoon, the community center buzzed with activity. Alex's sister's reading program had grown into something beautiful. Young children sat with elderly residents, sharing books and stories. Some of the older folks taught the kids how to knit or play chess in return. The sound of laughter and friendly chatter filled the rooms. Mrs. Lee had become something of a local celebrity. She turned her experience into a mission, speaking at schools about the importance of helping others. "You never know," she would tell the students, "when one small act of kindness might change not just one life, but an entire community." The students would lean forward in their seats, especially when she showed them the jacket Alex had given her that cold morning. She kept it as a reminder. Alex's mom didn't have to work double shifts anymore. The hospital's changes had spread to other businesses, creating more family-friendly schedules for working parents. She had time now to volunteer at the community center herself, teaching basic healthcare classes to elderly residents. Her nurse's knowledge, combined with her natural kindness, made her classes the most popular ones. The police department had completely transformed its approach to community policing. Officers now regularly attended neighborhood events, not as authority figures, but as members of the community. They'd started a program where they would check on elderly residents during extreme weather, something that had already prevented several dangerous situations like the one Mrs. Lee had experienced. The scholarship program named after Alex had already helped 3 students attend college. Each recipient had their own story of helping others, proving that kindness wasn't rare. It just needed to be recognized and encouraged. The local newspaper ran a weekly column featuring these everyday heroes, sharing their stories and inspiring others to help. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest one. People had started looking up from their phones, paying attention to their neighbors, noticing when someone might need help. The community had remembered something important, that everyone has value, regardless of their age or circumstances. On quiet evenings, Alex would still visit Mrs. Lee, playing chess or helping her with her tablet computer. She'd become like a grandmother to him, always ready with a cookie and a wise word. They often talked about that morning, not focusing on the misunderstanding, but on how it had brought out the best in people. His little sister had started middle school now, but she still walked home with her big brother most days. Other kids would join them, and they'd stop to help whoever needed it along the way. It had become so natural that nobody even thought about it anymore. Helping others was just what people did in their neighborhood. The story of the boy who was arrested for helping an elderly woman had faded from the headlines, but its impact lived on in the small, daily acts of kindness that had become routine. New families moving into the neighborhood quickly learned about the community's special spirit, and most embraced it wholeheartedly. As another year began, the changes that had started with one simple act of stopping to help continued to grow and evolve. In a world that often seemed focused on division and distrust, this small corner of the city had discovered something precious: the power of looking out for each other, of taking time to care, of believing in the good in people. And it all started because one young man, hurrying to school on a cold morning, heard someone calling for help and decided to stop.